There you go. All right, so we have Professor Eric Mack from Tulane University, who's a professor in philosophy there. Who's written a lot about rights of self-ownership, locking theory of property, and lots more that if I would continue listening on things that he's written about, that is very interesting and important, and cutting into what should be interesting. So he's going to talk to us about the separateness of persons, which is kind of nicely relating to what we were doing in our class at all. So hope you enjoy.
Good. Thank you very much, Bas. So yes, I'm going to give a talk. Title is Justice and the Separateness of Persons. And it's a fairly general talk that in some ways compares Rawls and Nozick. I'm going to start by talking about the general contrast between them in terms of their political perspective, but in particular in terms of their endorsement in one case and rejection in the other case of income redistribution as an appropriate goal of government. I'm then going to focus quite a bit on the separateness of persons argument, which I'm sure you've all encountered both in Rawls, specifically directed against utilitarianism, and then it's somewhat striking that in Nozick, at pretty much the same foundational level, Nozick invokes the same or pretty close to the same separateness of persons argument. That raises the question, which of their conclusions with respect to redistribution of income, with respect to whether or not the state has as one of its main functions creating the proper distribution of income, which of their conclusions, where Rawls affirms that and Nozick rejects that, fits better with the separateness of persons argument, right? And I'm going to suggest that if you take seriously the separateness of persons argument, you should side against Rawls's conclusions and in favor of Nozick's conclusions. I'm not saying that this is like a proof, but that the separateness of persons argument, I think, is actually devastating to Rawls's own commitment to a conception of distributive justice that requires the state to manage and control the distribution of income in society. I think the separateness of persons argument is devastating to that, and that it tilts towards or leans towards Nozick's quite contrary conclusions. And most of you will know, I guess all of you probably, that Nozick describes his position on distributive justice. His preferred phrase is justice in holdings. His preferred position he calls the historical entitlement view. So I'm going to suggest that if you take seriously the separateness of persons argument, which again both Rawls and Nozick seem to express and endorse, you're on the road to Nozick-like conclusions rather than Rawls-like conclusions. Someone might say that this is just a reductio of the separateness argument, because anything that puts you on the road to Nozick-like conclusions has got to be wrong. It just occurred to me that somebody might have that extremely odd view, so I mentioned it at this point. Okay. So the lecture that I'm going to give is kind of carefully worked out, but there are points at which it could easily be that what I'm saying is not terribly clear. If something is not clear, if you're puzzled about something, it's probably true that other people are puzzled, and so stop me and I will try to clarify, and we'll see how that works out. I do eventually want to barrel through the lecture as I've prepared it, but we can work at some sort of accommodation along those lines. Let's see. Oh, also, I should say that about a year ago, I discovered this incredible newfangled thing called PowerPoint. All right, it was just, and I've gotten real excited about it. I get excited about it when I'm making up the lecture, and I think, oh, I'll like do 3 or 4 slides, and instead I end up with like 62 slides, right? And then, of course, I lose my capacity to operate the machinery here, so be gentle with me when I get confused. Having already departed from my text a little bit, I have no idea where I am on the slides. We're going to talk about roles, separateness of persons, entitlement theory. Okay. I've already sort of contrasted roles and Nozick. We don't have to worry about the dates here or the names of the books. The main thing I want to convey at this point, and this is a type of rhetorical move on behalf of Nozick, Rawls is the mainstream guy. What he believes is what almost everybody believes, not just political philosophers, but even such deep thinkers as can be found in English departments and communications departments. This is the mainstream view. If you want to be sort of an ordinary humdrum person, you should believe what Rawls believes. Nozick is the non-mainstream rebel, right? So that's my sort of neutral introduction to them. Okay. Well, the mainstream view that I'm talking about holds that the really crucial thing in terms of political philosophy is knowing how the really good things of life ought to be distributed among people in society. Ideally, if we could work up mechanisms which would distribute well-being so that everybody would get their right share or their fair share of well-being, maybe we would press the button on those mechanisms. But typically people recognize that we don't yet have those mechanisms, and it would be awfully scary if we did. So let's try instead to distribute those things which are conducive to people leading happy lives, lives of well-being, success. And among those things which are generally taken to be conducive is income. So one thing that if you think that the role of government is to induce a just distribution of good things among the members of society, very likely when you get more concrete about it, what you're going to say is we need a principle for the just distribution of income. Looks like we can more readily distribute. We could take some income from some people and transfer it to other people with only 80% of the amount that is taken being used up in administrative costs. It works well. That was an attempt at a joke that didn't go. So there's this view, right, that what's really crucial are these principles of distributive justice, and perhaps, and in Rawls, although there's a great deal more in Rawls than this, certainly the most distinctive principle of distributive justice that he expresses is his difference principle, which we'll get to in a second, which tells us how income should be distributed among people in society. So actually, I think I do not have a slide that expresses, no, okay. So coming back to the general argument of the paper, we're going to talk about the separateness argument. I'm going to argue that the implication of this separateness argument, which we haven't yet given, is that justice cannot be a matter of achieving a socially optimal distribution of income. That's an awkward way to say that according to all theories of distributive justice, like the difference principle, we have to be able to say which distribution of income in society among those that we could produce is the optimal one, is the best one. And I'm going to argue that if you take seriously the separateness of persons argument, you have to conclude that we can't do that, that we can't say which of these alternative distributions is the optimal one. If we can't say which of the distributions is the optimal one, or even with, it's not just a matter of we're uncertain. We can't, the whole process is close to nonsensical. Then we have to abandon the view that our understanding of the justice, our understanding of economic justice is a matter of seeing whether or not the holdings in society fit a particular distribution, and instead we have to get moved to something like Nozick's understanding. Nozick, the rebel, the non-humdrum advocate of not having the state control the distribution of income in society. Okay, so let's pick just a simple example here. Okay. Isn't that something? Say I created a slide? That's amazing. Okay. So the difference principle I meant to say, I forgot to say, you all know, what's the difference principle? Somebody express the difference principle for me, please.
The least well-off should be doing the best that they can, more or less.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. We might want to say, make some sort of phrase about this distribution versus some other distribution. Yes?
Inequality in society can be tolerated only as far as the least well-off are made better off by the distribution scheme.
Okay. I think that's right, but it's a bit of an understatement because you said that as long as the least well-off are made better off. And maximally, perfect, great, okay? So in terms of assessing or ranking different distributions, the principle says, look at the size of the income payout to the person who has the lowest income along any row, right? So this is the income payoff on this row. This is the lowest income payoff on this row. The just distribution is the distribution in which the lowest payout for that row, for that distribution, is higher than the lowest payoff for any other, right? So we're focused on this. Ultimately, we focus on the lowest position, and we do essentially everything we can with respect to income to raise that as much as possible. Okay. Against such distributivist sorts of theories, Nozick holds the view that, that what really matters in assessing the distribution of anybody's holdings, and what really matters in assessing the distribution that exists across individuals in a given society, is how those particular individuals acquired what they actually have. So the question is not how much does Ben have or how much does Jen have, but did Ben or Jen acquire what they have through, roughly speaking here, just means. So maybe Ben has this spear. There are different ways in which Ben could have gotten the spear. He could have killed the person who made it and run off with it. He could have nobly broken a branch off a tree and fashioned the spear. The first way of getting something, there's no argument for this at this point, but it's intuitive. The first way of getting the spear by killing somebody and taking it is not a just way of getting things. The way of getting a spear by creating it yourself out of material which did not already belong to anybody else, that would seem to be a good example of getting a spear by just means. So on Nozick's view, if we look at these two distributions, these are the two distributions that we know are somehow possible for this very small society of Ben and Jen, right? On Nozick's view, which of these two distributions is the better distribution? This might be a trick question. Okay, so if we look at the table, can we say which one is the best? No. Okay, so one way that distinguish the type of principles of economic justice that Rawls asserts and the type that Nozick asserts is that according to Rawls and to people who advocate similar distributive justice principles, won't worry about the right names for these things, if you have a table like this with this type of information, you can apply a certain formula, right? And that formula, in Rawls's case, is, well, look for which row has the highest, lowest number, right? That will tell you which of these distributions is the just distribution, right? And you'll say, oh gosh, I see now. This would be terribly unjust if it was possible to create this, right? Whereas on a Nozick-like theory, if someone goes to Nozick and says, okay, Nozick, tell us which of those two distributions is the just one or the more just one, Nozick says it's idiotic to think that you can say which is just or unjust on the basis of the information that's up there, right? Because justice and holdings is so much a matter of how people have gotten their holdings, justly or unjustly, and none of that information is available on this chart. Okay, so I'm still setting up things. Okay, there's our difference principle. There's Nozick's historical entitlement theory. Read it real fast, okay? Okay. The separation of persons argument occurs in Rawls when Rawls is eliminating early in a theory of justice what he thinks is his main philosophical opposition. He thinks his main philosophical opposition is utilitarianism, right? Do I at any point say what utilitarianism is? Maybe sort of in a minute, okay? When Rawls writes this work in 1971, he's probably right to say that at least in most English-speaking countries, if there was a dominant view, it was utilitarianism, dominant substantive view. Okay? He wants to reject utilitarianism. Everyone who has a new theory wants to emphasize that his theory is superior to the reigning theory, right? So he's got to knock down utilitarianism. Okay. For our purposes, utilitarianism is a doctrine that each person ought to perform the action which, of all the actions available to her under the circumstances, maximizes the balance of happiness over unhappiness, right? So we want the greatest aggregate balance of happiness over unhappiness across society, right? Or some utilitarians might say across the globe or across the universe, across all sentient life. Everyone's fine with knowing what utilitarianism is, right? Good. Yeah, I don't have to look at Terry. Yeah, Terry, I better stop and explain a little more. Okay. Okay. So here's the now. So what Rawls does. This is another very common sort of philosophical maneuver, not really disreputable, is when you want to criticize, you want to establish your own view. So you declare some other view as the crucial contender against your view, right? Then what do? You then ascribe to that view the crucial argument for it, right? Then you show that the crucial argument you've ascribed to the contender is wrong, and maybe you show, this is where actually I'm saying Rawls does not succeed, maybe you show that your own position is not subject to the same criticism, right? And then your position is the last man standing and succeeds, right? So you'll see Nozick argues in this way too. He criticizes all the other theories about distributive justice, and most of his argument is, well, there are these problems for all these other theories, and my theory doesn't have the problem, so you should. So again, it's not a disreputable. you got to be fair about what the argument is you ascribe to, and there's some question about the fairness of Rawls, and maybe of Nozick here, when they're attacking utilitarianism. Okay. Here's the basic structure of the utilitarian argument that Rawls is out to attack. Okay. This is very abstract. I'll fill it in a second. So it's reasonable to accept a certain principle of individual choice. Okay. I'll tell you what that is in a second. If it's reasonable to accept this principle of individual choice, it's also reasonable to accept a certain principle of social choice. Again, this is all the argument that Rawls is ascribing to the utilitarian. And remember, it's being ascribed to the utilitarian so that Rawls can give it a knockout punch and establish his own view. If those are true, it's reasonable to accept that principle of social choice, right? Even I can tell that that's a valid argument. So what is the principle of individual choice, according to Rawls, that's operating in this argument? Okay? Principle of individual choice is that, at least if no other party is affected, let's not worry about that too much, that's interesting. It is rational for an individual to incur costs for herself or to forego benefits for herself if doing so will spare her greater costs or provide her with greater benefits, right? So what does that say, right? It's pretty simple and straightforward, right? It's rational for me, standard example, it's rational, Ben is my character at this point in the paper, it's rational for Ben to go to the dentist today and get this cavity drilled and filled, even though that will cause him 5 units of pain, because that will enable him to go to the beach tomorrow and have 20 units of happiness at the beach, right? If he didn't go today, he'd still be bothered by the discomfort. He wouldn't have. So cost is 5, gain is 20. The principle of individual choice says it's rational, right? In fact, that's about the most basic thing that we're all pretty confident about in talking about practical rationality, right? It's, low cost, high gain, right? Good. The principle of social choice that the utilitarian wants to get to by inference is it's rational for an individual to incur costs for herself or forego benefits for herself if doing so will spare anyone greater costs or provide greater benefits, right? That is to say, if anybody gets to go to the beach and get 20 units of pleasure, right, from your getting 5 units of pain at the dentist, you have exactly the same reason, actually, to go, right? That's what the utilitarian principle of social choice. The difference is brilliantly illustrated by this little picture, which it didn't come out quite as clearly as I would like. But here's Ben. He's at the dentist. The drill. That produces Ben going to the beach, you see, sand, water. The principle of individual choice says that's rational. Okay, sure looks rational. The principle of social choice says Ben goes to the dentist, he gets the drill, somehow, right, don't worry about how, because he does that, Jen at the beach, sun, water, having a good time, right? Principle of social choice of the utilitarian says that's the principle of social choice the utilitarian is endorsing, and the utilitarian argument that we saw a sketch of says if you accept this principle, you should also accept this principle. They're rationally on a par. Okay. Well, at first blush, anyway, it doesn't look like they're rationally on a par, right? It looks like what makes it rational for you to go to the dentist is that you will get to go to the beach the next day, right? It looks like a stretch to say you have the same reason to go to the dentist if instead of your being able to go to the beach the next day, this person who you don't really know or care much about gets to go to the beach, right? It's not like you really know and like Jen and she comes back and tells you what a great time she had and that makes you happy, right? There's no positive feedback. to you. Okay. So Rawls says, but utilitarians aren't stupid. They must have some sort of argument here. There must be something going on. So Rawls says, here's what's going on. Utilitarians are thinking that we can not only talk about the costs and benefits to individuals, we can, in a certain sense, talk about the cost and benefits to society. This brings up my next illuminating page, okay? So up here, this is back with the individual choice, right? Here's Ben, he gets 5 units of pain, you can tell from his mouth. Here's Jen, she gets 20 units of pain. You put these two things together, and what do you get? You get something that's beneficial for Jen and something that's costly for Ben. Period, maybe, right? Period, maybe. This is going to be Nozick's point, and also, to some extent, Rawls's point. How can you think that Ben has a good reason to bring about this complex, these two states of affairs, right? Where the only thing that redounds to him is the pain, right? Not at all the pleasure or the happiness, right? You know, if somebody said to you, give me a reason to go to the dentist today, and they said, well, if you go to the dentist, some stranger who you don't know about, don't care about in any emotional way, will have a really nice day. You go, I was asking for a reason for me to go to the dentist today, right? So it's puzzling. Okay. Rawls says, well, it's less puzzling. Maybe the argument goes through if we think a little bit differently about things. Let's think, suppose this is what the utilitarian must be thinking. He must be thinking that what we have pictured here as self-sufficient individuals are really better thought of as parts of society, members of society. The dotted lines represent, right? They're just a part of this larger thing, right? Here is society, right? And what happens in the dentist and Jen goes to the beach story is that 5 units of pain take place at the location in society which is Ben, right? In Ben there are 5 units of pain, and therefore there are 5 units of pain in society because Ben is part of society. But it's also true that in Jen, there are going to be 20 units of happiness or pleasure. The pleasure takes place in that portion of society, which is Jen. But the really interesting thing that we can say is society undergoes 5 units of pain, right? There are 5 units of pain for society and 20 units of pleasure or happiness for society. And so it really does turn out to be worthwhile for society that Ben undergo the 5 units of pain and Jen get the compensating 20 units, right? In this case, Ben goes, what good does it do me that Jen gets these 20 units of pleasure? In this case, on behalf of society, we can say these 5 units of pain were compensated for in the life of society by the 20 units of pleasure that the other party gets, right? So Rawls says that must be the way that the utilitarian is thinking about the situation, because notice in a way what the utilitarian who thinks this way is doing is he's saying there's actually this other individual, much bigger individual, and really what's going on here is just the principle of individual choice. This society, this agent says, I'm willing to incur 5 units of pain in part of my existence so that there be 20 units of pleasure in this other part of my existence, right? So Rawls says, so it must be that's the idea that's at work in the utilitarian. But of course, what Rawls has been doing is this is this is part of the critique, right? We've now said, so this is really what the utilitarian argument depends upon. Wonderful, because this is obviously false. It's not true, and this is where all these famous lines in Rawls comes in. Rawls says that this argument that the utilitarian is committed to doesn't take seriously the separateness of persons. Right? It consists of conflating persons into a single whole. It consists of fusing persons, right? All this is language in Rawls. It doesn't recognize the plurality of distinct individuals. It views society as this type of conglomerate, whereas society is correctly perceived as a type of association of separate beings, right? Beings that have solid lines around them. So that's the problem with utilitarianism, right? Okay. So that's the knockout punch. Okay. So I want to explore a little bit the implications of this argument that we just gave. And as I telegraphed before, I think the implications of this argument, or the implications of what we can draw out of this argument, is that Rawls's project of identifying what the best distribution of income is equally undermined, So, we're back to a similar table, but I put happiness because we're sort of talking about, why are we talking about utilitarianism here? Yes. So suppose, so which of these rows is the better row according to utilitarianism? The first, right? Because the total is greatest? Okay. So imagine somebody says, how did I want to set this up? So what Rawls seems to have said, or I think this is an implication of what he has said, is that if somebody says about utilitarianism, look, clearly you want to go for distribution 1 because clearly distribution 1 is socially better, right? It's socially better because the total amount of happiness that will exist on the distribution 1 is better than the total, is greater than the total that would exist on the distribution 2. It sounds like the Rawls who has just expressed the separation of persons argument is going to say, don't tell me about it being better for society. Let's talk about its impact on actual separate persons. If we talk about its impact on actual separate persons, then I can understand why Jen is in favor of this distribution, right? And it's true that this distribution is better for Jen. Of the two, it's the optimal one for Jen, right? But if we don't get captured in some false thinking about the nature of society, we also have to look at distribution, how distribution 1 does for Ben. And distribution 1 is worse for Ben than this. So all that can be said about distribution 1 is that it's better for Jen but worse for Ben. If we recast all our attempts to rank distributions in terms of its effect on the distinct plurality of individuals, right, then almost always, I'm ignoring the cases where everybody is better off, right? Almost always, a distribution that is better for one of the parties is going to be worse for some other party, right? And it doesn't really make any sense except if we go back to, what's the Jabba the Hutt, right? Except if we go back to that model, it doesn't make any sense to say. that, that this distribution is better than that, okay? But now let's turn the tables, right? We've said that distribution 2 is the distribution which is best of the two, is the optimal distribution, not on utilitarian grounds, but according to Rawls's difference principle, right? But, you know, what is it? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Is that the old-fashioned, right? Okay. So suppose somebody says, yeah, let's go for this. Let's go for this. And on this occasion, it's Jen who goes, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Ben says, look, there is some loss to Jen here, but according to the difference principle, this is the better distribution, and so shut up, Jen, right? Jen goes, wait a minute, I just heard this argument against utilitarianism. How about this argument? Yes, distribution 2 is better for Ben, right? But it's worse for me, right? Unless we go back to Java the Hutt, or Hutt, is it H-U-T, is that the name? Yeah. We have to see that there is no better argument if we're duly sensitive to the existence of the separateness of persons. There's no better argument for this being a better distribution than this. There's no better argument for this being a better distribution than this than there is for this being a better distribution for this. Okay, so that's the argument that that if we criticize utilitarianism in the way that is criticized by the separateness of persons argument, we do indeed knock out utilitarianism, but it looks like if we take that argument, that separation of persons argument to heart, we also knock out the difference principle. We knock out any formula which tells us that we should endorse some distribution where that the attractive part of that distribution is that some persons or positions end up better off under it than any of the others, but in which it's still nevertheless true that some people end up worse off, right? How are you sufficiently paying attention to the separateness of persons if you make that endorsement? Okay. So my point here, coming back to my text, way into it, is that Rawls sets out to discredit the utilitarian principle for social choice, but the argument that he makes discredits all principles of social choice, including formula like the difference principle, that tells us how to rank alternative distributions. Difference principle is just another formula that seeks to identify which of the available distributions is socially optimal. Indeed, various slogans within a theory of justice seems to affirm this anti-social choice conclusion. So there's a very famous one where he says even the welfare of society as a whole doesn't justify imposing losses on some people. I'm embarrassed to say that looking back through my old beat-up Rawls book, I found another sentence which is even more, I think, damaging to Rawls in the way that I've been talking about than that. Shortly after he states the separateness of persons argument, Rawls says, each member of society is thought to have, that's Rawls's way of saying, I believe this, but I don't quite want to say I believe it, right? It's thought to have by those of us who know, an inviolability founded on justice, or, as some say, on natural right, which even the welfare of everyone else cannot override, right? The suggestion there is that if one person is worse off, right, with respect to a given distribution, then no matter what the gains to others, presumably all, including those who are in the lowest position, it goes against the inviolability of people to endorse that distribution. Okay. Speeding up. So I've finished the sections, sort of, that cover both the contrast and Rawls's separation of persons argument. I want to get to the shorter sections on Nozick's use of the separation of persons argument, and then on to Nozick and historical entitlement. Let me play here for a moment to, oh, you see, I don't get to do this this is a little speech I put in Ben's mouth. I don't need no stinking utility. I don't get to do that. Another formula. Okay. So when Nozick is sort of at the same stage of developing his normative view, it's, I think, commonly noticed that he, without referring to Rawls there, gets things going by stating the utilitarian position in a way which is the same as Rawls states the utilitarian position, and criticizing it in strikingly, at least to begin with, strikingly similar way. Okay? So here, remembers where I'm saying there's going to be a divide, because Nozick goes on to endorse a conception of justice and holdings that is not undercut by the separation of persons argument in the way that Rawls is. Okay. Okay, so he's setting it up. This is the he's raising the possibility that maybe we should endorse a utilitarian view. We each, individually, we each sometimes choose to undergo some pain or sacrifice for a greater benefit or to avoid a greater harm. Ben going to the dentist. Right? In each case, some cost is borne for the sake of the greater overall good. He could have put in greater overall individual good, right? That's what he's talking about here. Why not, he asks, similarly hold that some persons have to bear some costs that benefit other persons more for the sake of the overall social good, right? So this is similarly, this is like saying, look, we have this principle of individual choice. There's also this principle of social choice. Doesn't the principle of social choice just sort of parallel and share the same rationality as the principle of individual choice? And Nozick answers, but there is no social entity, right? You see how I've set it up, with a good that undergoes some sacrifice for its own good, right? Maybe if there were, and Rawls's claim is that that's really what the utilitarian must be thinking. Again, my own view is that Nozick makes things a little bit too easy for himself here, and Rawls does too, but there are only individual people, different individual people with their own individual lives, using one of these people for the benefit of others, uses him and benefits the others. Nothing more. What happens is that something is done to him for the sake of others. Talk of an overall social good covers this up. Okay? That's Nozick's, in a way, recasting of, okay? So if we go that far with Nozick, we should, as I was saying before, as I suggested before, as is implied by Rawls, we have to say that whenever we encounter those rows on a table representing different alternative distributions, and we're tempted to say that one of those distributions is better than the other because we like what's going on in one of the columns, or we like what's going on if we add the columns, we can't stop there. We have to look at what actually is happening or is being done to each of the particular individuals who is going to be moved away from the distribution in which things go well for him. And if separation of persons argument says that we should do that, then we're never going to, when we have significant choices to make between alternative distributions, we're never going to be able to do it by ranking those distributions against one another. Okay. Nozick, however, so what have we gotten to? We've gotten to so far the idea that a certain sort of project, a project that involves coming up with principles which will allow us to rank these alternative distributions is perhaps fatally wounded. Okay? Nozick obviously wants to go beyond just that. He doesn't want to just deliver this negative message, right? Even if he can say it's a negative message that applies not only to utilitarianism, but also to my colleague down the hall, Professor Rawls. Okay? Because Nozick wants to argue, let's see if I have a slide about this. I don't know if I do. Okay, not quite. Nozick wants to argue that, that it's not just, it's one thing to say that an attempted justification for imposing a loss on an individual fails, right? I can justify imposing this loss on an individual because by imposing this loss, I will create the greatest total happiness. I can justify imposing a loss on a particular individual because by imposing that loss, I will produce a situation in which the worst off is as well off as possible, right? It's one thing to say all those justifications fail, right? From that, you can conclude that there is no positive justification for imposing these losses, right? But Nozick wants to do something more than that, right? And you've all had some exposure, right? Nozick wants to say, at least in certain important cases, imposing losses on individuals wrongs those persons. I don't know whether, I didn't see like a giant light go on, right? Let me say it again. I'm sure that'll cause the light to, right? It's different. So if someone comes to me and says, I'm going to do certain things to you, and here's my justification, right? He gives me a bunch of justifications, and I knock them all down, right? So where do we stand? Where we stand is that he hasn't established that he has a justification for doing what he's doing, right? But I don't merely want to say, you don't have a justification. I want to say, I am justified in saying that it's wrong for you to do that, right? So we need to get, for what Nozick has to do is he has to somehow draw out of something like the separateness argument the conclusion that it wrongs people to impose sacrifices on them, right? A positive argument for the wrongfulness of imposing these sacrifices. Is that okay? We good? Good. Okay. So this is the hard part in Nozick, right? And I'm going to express an argument which I describe as suggestive, but it's not one of these wonderful deductive proofs that everyone would like to have. Okay. So in earlier passages, Nozick has said things like, if I have it here, no, I don't have some of those earlier passages, but he repeats what exist are individuals with their own ends. There's no way to balance gains to some people against losses to other. This type of moral balancing doesn't work for the sorts of reasons that we've already been talking about. But then he goes further. He says these things, and I've highlighted a couple of these words to emphasize both what he's trying to do and also that it's suggestive at most. He says to use a person in this way, that is to say to impose a loss on a person in order to deliver a gain to others, to use a person in this way does not sufficiently respect and take account of the fact that he is a separate person, that his is the only life he has. Let me back up for a second. In order to knock out the utilitarian, and also I'm saying the defender of the difference principle, Nozick says, I'm just referring to the fact of the separateness of persons. Although he says that's equivalent to or entails that this moral balancing across persons is not possible. That's the fact. And he quite explicitly says the fact of separateness of persons sort of is, or an aspect of it, is that there's this moral balancing is not possible. Okay? But then he goes on and he no longer talks about the fact of separateness, but he goes on and talks about a reflection of that fact, right? Now this is a way of saying, I'm not quite sure how to get to this further set of propositions, but bear with me, right? Maybe there's something to it. And I think there is, so that's my 2 cents. To use a person in this way does not sufficiently respect and take account of the fact that he is a separate person, that his is the only life that he has. Moral side constraints, you've all encountered this language, upon what we may do, reflect the fact of our separate existences. They reflect the fact that no moral balancing act can take place. Notice, so here we've equated the fact of our separate existence with the fact that no moral balancing can take place. But then there's something else beyond that, which is the reflection of those, that there are moral side constraints. This root idea, namely, that there are different individuals with separate lives, and so no one may be sacrificed to others, underlies, right, the existence of moral side constraints. Okay? So I'm not going to try to reinforce this argument here. I said it's suggestive. I think it can be reinforced. But the point here is that Nozick asserts, now this is something not asserted by Rawls, that if you take seriously the separateness of persons argument and what is reflected by the things that are mentioned in that argument, then you will adopt this view that the fundamental principles of justice or of right are principles about how we may or may not treat other people, right? They're not principles about the correct distribution. They're not principles about what ought to be maximized across society. They're principles about what forms of interaction with other people are acceptable and what forms of interaction are not. The acceptable ones are the ones that respect and take account of the fact that other people and so on. The unacceptable ones are the ones that don't take account of that. Okay. Now, what would be really, really nice would be a way to go from these conclusions about side constraints, which again I've only said are suggested by these passages. If we could go from these conclusions about side constraints and deduce from that Nozick's whole historical entitlement theory, that would be terrific. I don't know whether one could do that. You certainly can't do it in a very, very short amount of time, which is less than I have. Okay? So what I want to do is just mention one argument that goes from the conclusion that Nozick reaches here to the elimination of all the competitors that Nozick thinks he has, right? So it's not a positive argument for the historical entitlement, but it's an argument, we've seen these types of arguments at work, it's an argument for why all the alternatives are defective. Okay? Let's see. Once again, on the screen, I wish I had more good pictures. We're skipping that. We're skipping that. So the last bit of discussion was the suggestive argument for the proposition that the separateness of persons supports the thesis that all individuals have basic rights to live their own lives in pursuit of their own separate systems of ends. Okay? That's a little bit of a jump, but let's allow it. Right? So now we're allowing that Nozick has not just dismissed alternative views about things like utilitarianism and the difference principle, but he's managed to go on and say, I've reached a positive conclusion. This conclusion that somehow we can squeeze out of the separateness of persons argument that says each person has these fundamental rights to live their own lives in pursuit of their own separate systems of ends, right? That's supposed to tie it back to the separateness argument. That's the first premise of this argument that I'm now saying is in Nozick, right? It is in Nozick. Okay. Second premise, this basic right is violated by policies that treat individuals as though they are, at least in part, owned by other people. Right? For if one is owned, even in part, by other people, one will not fully enjoy a right to live one's own life in pursuit of one's own ends. I think that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Most important and contentious premise. All doctrines of distributive justice other than the historical entitlement theory call for policies that treat individuals as though they are, at least in part, owned by other people. That's going to require a little bit of support. Okay? Conclusion, again, I think it's valid, and just assumed it was when I wrote it. Excuse me, I don't intend any disrespect for students, right? That's kind of the thing some of us have heard from students. I thought it was okay. But everyone says it. Okay. Therefore, all doctrines of distributive justice other than historical entitlement violate the basic rights that are supported by the separateness of persons argument. Right? Again, tying it back here to show that this sort of negative by negation proof of Nozick's theory goes back to the argument that Rawls and Nozick share, right? That's the cute part here. Okay, so I think everything depends upon 3 here. This is the crucial premise, and we'll get to that and conclude quickly. Okay, so this is, I think, the argument on behalf. This is in the section called Redistribution and Property Rights in Chapter 7 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So I'm extracting this. Policies that are enacted in the name of principles of distributive justice, like Rawls's difference principle, appropriate the fruits of some people's talents, efforts, and labor, maybe I should say, or labor, and seek to use those fruits to advance the interests of others. At least in part, these policies take away from those individuals the right to decide what ends will be served by their decisions, actions, and efforts. At least in part, such policies treat those individuals like beasts of burden, whose capacities and efforts may be made to serve the ends of others. Okay? That's the argument. I think it's not a bad argument for premise 3 there. Okay? If we accept these 3 premises, then we get to this conclusion. All doctrines of distributive justice, other than the historical entitlement, violate the basic rights that are supported by the separateness of persons argument, which Rawls himself, so in a way this is arguing that there's an internal inconsistency in Rawls, right? This whole argument, in some ways, plus various additional subsidiary premises, gets triggered by the separateness of persons argument, but one conclusion of the argument is that the difference principle has got to be mistaken. So, So Nozick's conclusion is the only alternative to doctrines that endorse such rights-violating policies is the adoption of the historical entitlement theory, justice and holdings. My conclusion is the separateness of persons argument that's shared by Rawls and Nozick undermines Rawls's mainstream view about distributive justice and supports Nozick's anti-mainstream, revolutionary, radical, nonconformist historical entitlement doctrine. Thanks. So there's a lot of stuff there. Things that people might have been puzzled about along the way. In some cases, there are arguments which I am ascribing to Nozick, but am not necessarily endorsing myself. Most of them I'm endorsing myself. So there's all this and anything else that that you might think you can correctly accuse me of. I'm prepared to defend.
But I'll ask it in a way that hopefully will get people. So about the 3rd premise in the Nozick's argument.
Yeah.
Beasts of burden.
Yeah, that was a little. Did you find that a little shock? A little. Yeah.
Flourish, maybe? Anyway, my question is this.
Subjects of burden.
Yeah. So in class we talked a little bit about one way that you might defend Nozick's theory about Mack's idea that taxation would be like forced labor.
Yes,
And you
yes,
might think this is true because you buy something like Locke's theory of labor mixing.
yes,
So that's
yes,
property that people own,
yes, yes.
that they're being taxed on,
Yes.
really represents their work and therefore their bodies.
yes.
Now, unless I'm
Yeah.
misremembering,
Yeah.
you don't buy this part of the law.
I don't think it's the major part of the right story about property rights. So, no. So we actually, I've noticed that. You don't think I buy it at all. I do buy it as the correct story of a certain small percentage of property rights. Yeah.
All right, well, let's
Yeah.
ask a different
Yeah.
way then.
No, but that's, yeah.
Well, let's say
But
that
those
I
are-
inherit some money, right?
Yes, yes.
So
Good,
here's $1,000
good,
that I
good,
inherit.
good, good.
Doesn't, even if Locke is right, it's not my labor, right? I just
That's right.
dropped in my
That's
bank.
right. That's right.
So I'm being taxed on it.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
How am I a beast or subject to derivative?
Sure. Good, 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 good. So, yeah. Well, it doesn't say, of course, that the argument here doesn't say that every bit of taxation is appropriates the fruits of people's talents, efforts, and labor. So that's part of that. Maybe part of an answer.
Inheritance tax could be enacted in the name of distributive justice, right? Like to like, get people
It-
started.
Or it could be at least or this argument. Now, so in my very quick attempt to protect the argument against that objection, I have said that on a correct construal, this argument doesn't count against inheritance taxes. And I don't want to say that. No, I mean, I think you're right. So you're right. This argument doesn't. It doesn't, right? You need some other argument. Right. So actually, that is what I was in effect saying in my first comment, that it's not true that all taxes fall to this argument, right? But maybe inheritance taxes would be among the minority that survive. Yeah. Let me just add one. I think that that Nozick himself is sort of very cagily avoids ever asserting, right, this labor theory. And I think I may have made a mistake in summarizing it by even putting the word labor here. Nozick talks about your time, your effort, right? I don't think he ever really says labor where he's actually endorsing an argument, because I think he's just so leery of being accused of accepting this funny mixing metaphor. But I think he needs something, right? He needs general comment to all of you who've read this stuff. Sort of the traditional order of topics, and it's most clear in Locke, right, is first you establish sort of rights of people somehow over themselves and maybe over their labor, and then you use that to lay out a theory of property rights, right? And then you condemn various interventions because they're interventions against the person or the property. That Nozick almost explicitly avoids, he obviously, manifestly avoids that. It looks like he wants to say, there are problems with all these alternative theories of justice, right? And the main argument for accepting my historical entitlement view, which is an explanation of how property arises, is not that I can show you how the steps by which property arise really give you a claim. It's just that all the other theories are so caca, right? All the other theories have these internal problems. They turn on themselves in various ways. They don't recognize the role that historical information should play. So that's why you should accept the historical entitlement, right? And if you do, then that turns into an account of property without our filling in any of the details about how it can be that particular actual actions will produce. So yeah, I think he's really, really, in that way, the order of topics is very different from Locke.
I
Sir.
I was going to say, couldn't the inheritance tax fall to the idea that, well, it's your parents' talent and
Good,
assets, so
good,
you do what
good,
you want with it.
good. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, and as soon as I got it, that was so nice because halfway through the sentence I knew this guy, yes. So we're turning, it's not so much the right of the recipient, it's the right of the donor, right? And then I think this comes a right of bequeathal, right? Now, you also have the standard problems that people will raise about whether dead people have rights, right? But I like to think they do. Because otherwise you couldn't. So you're right. That's very good. I mean, it could be that it's the person who bequeaths the funds whose rights are infringed, rather than the person who would be the recipient. So the recipient has complaints on behalf of the donor, not on his own behalf.
Are the giver's rights unlimited? Are the giver's rights unlimited?
So what happens if I say yes?
And I'll say, suppose he has a quantity of food enough to feed 3 people, and he gives it all to one person and 2 other people starve.
So it depends on who those starving people would be. So let's specify to make it simple, right? Not through any fault of their own, right? And things like that, right? Well, I've sort of talked about. So my first answer, right, and there's got to be more down the road, is that that starving people aren't obligated to leave the food on the table, or even if it's somebody else's, what we normally would call somebody else's food, right? And then exactly what the relationship is between those people becomes more complicated, and exactly what it's rational for us to do together to deal with situations. Yeah. Okay. Can't induce any more. Your professor told me that the person who asks the very best question and who's not wearing a blue shirt gets 10 extra points. But
this is going to somewhat be a series.
Oh, good.
Is 100% taxation for the purposes of a redistributed scheme similar to 100% forced labor?
Oh, yeah. I really don't like the forced labor line in Nozick. I think the only thing that's forced is that you're required to file the taxes. That's forced, right? But the labor isn't forced. So I think that's a misstep on Nozick's part.
What about the labor that you're getting taxed for? So like you work 40 hours,
Yes.
you get $35 hours worth of labor.
Yes.
Wages.
Yeah.
The other 5
Yeah.
hours you work.
Yeah. See, so I think that this is part of what I was talking about before, Nozick's reluctance to rely upon a theory of property rights, right? He should have the alternative would have been to develop more straightforwardly a theory of property rights, and then he could just say the taxation is a violation of those rights. But instead, he has to say what's wrong with taxation is, I'm not going to say it's a violation of property rights. It's sort of what's wrong with taxation goes through this transparent area where our theory of property rights should be, and tries to go back to something earlier, like labor or time or effort, right? But I just don't see that works. Yeah.
So would partial taxation amount to partial ownership of one person?
Yes. That's according to this principle here, right? So, in my, somebody in the paper I wrote when I was talking about partial ownership, imagine that somebody owns you, but only on Tuesdays or Thursdays, right? Well, this seems to have a, significant impact on your ability to use your own resources and intelligence and person to advance your own ends. And just similarly, if somebody, so I don't think it's so implausible to say that there's a type of partial ownership that goes on. What goes on is an exercise of one of the main elements of having a property right is being able to is having a right to the income that derives from the thing that you have a property right of, right? Like if you have a rental property. So if you treat people as though you have a right to 20% of their income, that seems like having a partial property right in them.
So how is it then that taxation being partial ownership of a person is not morally, if not effectively, through practice, a form of forced labor?
Well, because the reason I hesitate is I take the forced labor quite literally, right? So nobody is waving a billy club at you. Nobody's putting a gun at your head at that moment. If they do, right, it's real. Yeah, but if they do, and if they do that and say, okay, you now have to dig this hole, right, that's forced labor. But if they put the gun at your head and say, hand over 20% of last year's income, right, then the forced labor is you're handing it over. It's not your having generated that income. That's, yeah. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Do you mind if I share these slides with students on
No, not at all. No, sure.
I'll post
Can you then send me access to the lecture?
the taping of it?
Yeah, good. I'd like that, yeah.